give a little bit of, oh, got it. I asked her also just a little bit of on sort of guardianship to help us all get more knowledgeable on these issues. As you know, since we've got some alumni here, Judge Glen was Dean of the CUNY Law School, but she was also a lawyer and a jurist as well as an educator. She clerked for the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and spent 12 years in private practice, 15 years as a member of the judiciary, serving on the New York City Civil Court and the New York State Supreme Court. And in Women's World, an organization whose board she's on, they quoted her as, their reference says, as a judge, she wrote major cutting-edge decisions in a wide range of areas, including AIDS, sexual harassment, the rights of the physically and mentally challenged, the elderly, and on constitutional issues such as free speech. She is an expert in supported decision-making and is working in that issue in the international arena, as well as nationally and locally, and will bring a wealth of knowledge to us as we look upon where that frame, if you will, can fit in the larger context of the work that we do. I've given her a short period of time to speak, which is most unfortunate, but as you see, we have a very packed agenda. So I am looking upon this as the start of what I hope will be many deep conversations we have about these critical issues. So she has about 20 minutes to speak and 10 minutes for question, and I'm going to try and keep us on that schedule. So with that, Judge Glen, take it away.
So thank you, Joan, and thank you, Kimberly, who's going to run my slides for me because I'm completely technologically challenged. And just to say something to begin with, there are slides here. I hate people who do PowerPoints and read them, but I find them quite useful if they're made available to an audience, because then you don't have to take notes and you have all the information. And so that's one purpose. And the second purpose, particularly tonight, is that this is such a complicated subject and there is so much to say. And I understand that, many of you are coming at this for the first time, that maybe it'll keep me on track and from going off with more detail than would be feasible within the amount of time that I have, so that I only get halfway through the presentation. So first, just let me give you an overview of what I hope to accomplish, what I hope to talk about. First, I want to talk to you about supported decision-making, which I'm probably going to say SDM just because it's faster. What it is generally, and what we at Supported Decision Making New York, which I will call SDMNY, have done with people with IDD, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and then how different SDM can look across populations with very different cognitive impairments. There is no one size fits all here, and that's obviously what makes it especially complicated. I want to talk, even though this is probably not what you signed up for, on how human rights, and particularly Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I will call the CRPD, help us conceptualize and instrumentalize these differences towards the ultimate goal that, clearly you as an organization and as the board of an organization share towards maximizing and preserving autonomy and self-determination, and of course, dignity. Then I want to talk about how the human rights lens aligns with Project Guardianship's mission and strategic plan, which I compliment you on, by the way. I thought it was a great strategic plan and enjoyed reading it, even though you may not have been thinking about human rights when you wrote it, why this is all so important and why you should care about it. And finally, this is sort of the call to action in the next conversation, how Project Guardianship can play a critical, I laughingly say, catalytic role in doing for older persons, particularly with cognitive decline, what we and my colleagues around the world have been able to do for people with IDD. So first slide, which is who we are. And I say this, not pridefully, but because in a way it is a sort of blueprint of how you have to proceed in doing this work. So in 2016, we got a 5-year grant from DDPC in order to educate people about supported decision-making, develop a process for people to use, and then pilot it as an alternative to guardianship, both for people who were at risk of guardianship and also for people who are already under guardianship. And, obviously COVID came in the middle of this. We didn't finish all of our objectives by the end of the 5th year because we were kind of cut off from the work that we did, which was very face-to-face. And we were very fortunate to get funding for a bridge year from Ford and then 2 other foundations that fund in the area. that ran out on March 31st, and we have just begun a quite large and very exciting and somewhat terrifying grant from OPWDD to actually now design and pilot a service delivery system that will make the SDM facilitation process that we have developed and piloted available to anybody with IDD who wants it. So that's who we are. Next slide. And I've said that we were sort of started because we were supposed to look at alternatives to guardianship, and you are the Project Guardianship. And so let me just quickly say something about guardianship, because I think it gets lost, and that it is the legal process by which the state, through a court, takes from a person, basically, I mean, they're not supposed to under Article 81, but generally, all of that person's rights to decide everything about who they associate with, who they, if they want to go to work, where they live, if they want to get married, et cetera, because of their disability, and instead give all that power to make all those decisions to another person who is the guardian. And, you know, after Sarah's story, I'm really glad that it's you folks and Sarah, but it's not always quite as happy an ending as that for many people. Okay, next slide. So I also assume that most of you are not lawyers, but even though guardianship is widely used and with way too few constraints in its actual use in the courts, there are legal constraints on guardianship. First of all, as a matter of constitutional law, both under the federal constitution and under the New York State Constitution, it is an imperative that you can't put somebody under guardianship if there is a less restrictive alternative to achieve the state's purpose. And clearly that's what, you know, you were all trying to do with Miss C by using the least restrictive form of guardianship, but also the idea is that if you can do whatever protection really needs to be protected without imposing a guardian, that's what you're supposed to do. And then in addition to that, in mental hygiene law, Article 81, which I believe is the statute under which you get most of your guardianships, the statute itself says, I mean, it imposes on guardians the obligation to afford the person the greatest amount of independence and self-determination participation in all the decisions affecting such person's life. And it's clear that that's what you and your predecessor, Vera Project, have been committed to, again, unfortunately, all too rare in the world of guardianship. But it's right there in the statute. And then, it's not a legal constraint in the sense of being in a book of statutes, but I always think it's important to remember the golden rule here. And it's a way of, I think, committing us to doing the right thing. Okay, next slide. So there are a lot of less restrictive alternatives. Many of them are actually set out in Article 81 and in other guardianship statutes around the country. They include healthcare proxies, living wills, et cetera. So if the problem is that the person can't make decisions about their health, then if you have a healthcare proxy, that takes care of it. There are powers of attorney, there are trusts, there's representative payee for SSI. And then right in the statute, they talk about personal care services of the sort that you're obviously providing to many of your clients, which if they're in place, might not require a guardian at all. And then finally, and quite recently, and being built into statutes around the country, not yet New York, but under the Uniform Guardianship Law and so forth, supported decision-making named explicitly as a less restrictive alternative. Okay, next slide. So one question is, where does supported decision-making come from? And the quick answer is that it's how we all make decisions. We all get supports in decisions we make. Even if you think you're making a decision entirely on your own, like, should I have this medical procedure? Okay, I go onto Dr. Google and I read the studies, and then I decide based on the studies that I've read. You are getting support because somebody did that research that you are reading. So no one is a tub in a field. No one is just operating on their own. And we do it in different, different degrees, but it is the way everybody makes decisions. And long before people use the phrase supported decision-making, neurotypical people were using supported decision-making and non-neurotypical people were using supported decision-making. They just weren't calling it that. But it also comes from the human right literally an explicated human right that every person has the right to make their own decisions regardless of disability. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, next. So I put up this definition, which is quite widely used, because I think it begins to open up the complexities that we are dealing with and the variations that we are dealing with in what seems to be a single term, supported decision-making. But no, it's actually a series of relationships and or practices and or arrangements and or agreements of more and or less formality and or intensity. All these are variables designed to assist an individual with a disability to make and communicate decisions about their lives. So what's important here is that the overarching principle, the overarching thing that doesn't change regardless of all these other things, arrangements and agreements and blah, 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 is the centrality of decision-making itself, which to do this work really requires us to understand in a very granular way what decision-making entails. And then to understand that all decisions involve the use of supports, but that people with disabilities or particularly developmental disabilities or cognitive decline may simply need more or more intense support in order to make their own decisions. Okay, next slide. So this is a slide you should put a pin in and maybe play with, you know, later for yourselves or whatever. It turns out that there's now a whole niche industry in the country about teaching people to make decisions. And we're not talking about teaching people with IDD to make decisions. We're talking about teaching you know, people high up in the healthcare system, people high up in the military and so forth, because what we have learned in the last 15 or 20 years is that our sort of deluded belief that everyone who's okay makes decisions rationally is simply not true. We don't. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. There's the limbic system, there's whatever, decisions are made before we even know what the decision is. So teaching people how to make decisions and what the steps are is now something that is sort of very much in vogue. And the very same breakdown of the components of what goes into making a decision actually match up precisely with the kinds of support that people might want in any of them. So before you make a decision, you gather the necessary information. Well, some people are great at that and some people aren't. So you might hire an assistant, you might ask a friend or whatever. You might be able to get lots of stuff about, for example, studies that are being done about particular medical procedures, but not really understand them. So you might have a friend who's a medical professional, you might talk to them about that. Identifying possibilities and alternatives, because you start off thinking this is the decision, but well, maybe it doesn't have to be this decision. Maybe there's something else that you could do instead. You know, I have to get a new car. Well, maybe I actually don't have to buy a new car. Maybe I can lease a new car, or maybe I live in the city. And so it would actually be cheaper for me to just use public transportation than when I actually need a car, to call Uber or to rent one. So that's alternatives. Then understanding the consequences of making a particular decision, or actually also of not making that decision. Then weighing the alternatives, that's actually deciding, choosing among the alternatives. Communicating the decision to others, certainly for people who do not communicate verbally or traditionally, they may very well need support to do that. Stroke victims and so forth, people who are communicating with blinking their eyes, just to name some obvious ones. And then finally, getting support in implementing the decision. So we all do this, and we all use different supports or no supports in different steps. And that's true of people with disabilities as well. And so a lot of the process of what we do, and probably the process that we would do with older people, though in a different way, is, what are the things that you can do? What are the things you can't do? What are the things that you can do with support? Okay. So next. So before I talk about this slide, I just want to say, so that goes how everybody makes decisions, no matter who they are, no matter what impairments they have or they don't have. no matter what kinds of decisions they're making, and no matter what the source of their support is, whether it's a professional, whether it's research, whether it's a friend, a family member, or whatever. But within this, in this general overarching concept of supported decision-making, there are also lots of variables. And that's where, you know, when I went through decision, I went and/or. So there are variations in whether what you're talking about is relationships, or whether you're talking about is arrangements or practices. Those are all different things, and there are many variations within them. They can be more or less formal, they can be more or less intense. There are huge variations in the persons with disabilities that have the diminished capacity that may require this. So there are people with IDD, there are people with psychosocial disabilities, that's mental health. There are people with cognitive decline and dementia. I'm guessing that's probably close to a majority of your client base. And there are people with traumatic brain injury, or TBI. And then obviously there are variations in the kinds of decisions. I mean, everything from what am I going to wear today to do I have this major medical proceeding, or do I get married, or you know, what am I going to do about end of life decisions? So there are huge variables here, which makes it very complicated to talk about. Okay, so next. So what I want to do is just is kind of illustrate what one practice, remember all the variables, so one practice with one degree of formality for one group of people with cognitive impairment looks like. And that's what we do for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it is not the only way to do supported decision-making. It is one practice with one degree of formality for one group. And there are particular reasons why we do this, which we can talk about later if you're interested. But for starters, and again, this is kind of like a blueprint of what might happen if we want to do this for older people with cognitive decline and dementia, is that this process has been fairly robustly developed because many civil society and NGOs started looking at how to do supported decision-making for this population after the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was passed in 2008. So when we came into it in 2016, there were pilot projects in, of all places, still the best one, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Israel, Australia, Colombia, Peru, et cetera. So we were not starting from Jump Street. Everybody used a form of facilitation. And the question for us was, what would that look like given the constraints and the challenges of being in New York State with, an incredibly diverse population in both, race, citizenship status, language capability, urban, suburban, rural, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in our now 6 years, we have enrolled more than 150 people who we call decision makers. So I'll be referring to the people with IDD now as decision makers. We've trained more than 200 volunteer facilitators, and then those trained facilitators who speak with and are supervised by mentors at least once a month, work with the person with IDD, the decision maker, in 3 phases. Phase 1 is just with the decision maker. Phase 2 is the decision maker and the chosen supporters. And then phase 3 is actually negotiating and finalizing a supported decision-making agreement, or SDMA. Okay. Next. So what this is really creating a process that decision makers can use for the rest of their lives as they make decisions. It's very flexible. They can change supporters. They can change areas where they want support. They can change the kinds of support they want and need. But it's really to be a process that they can use, and then describing and formalizing that process in the SDMA. And I didn't have time to put anything in this about this, but right now there is legislation pending in the Assembly. It's already passed the Senate that would require third parties to accept decisions made by people pursuant to SDMAs made pursuant to a recognized facilitation process, because a lot of people with IDD are just discriminated against. I mean, this particularly happens to people with CP because the bank officer or the healthcare professional or something can't understand what they're saying, and so assumes that they're stupid or that they don't have capacity to make decisions. They just say, no, I'm not going to take it, get a guardian. and then I'll provide you with the services. Okay, next, and let me again interject for a minute. As I've said, this is just one way to do supported decision making for a particular group, and there are clearly many other ways to do it. So I'm not claiming the turf, it's just what we do. But we've learned a lot about what we don't know, what we can't do, and so forth. So for starters, to be totally candid, the supported decision-making model that we work with is we do not yet know how to do this for people with the most severe impairments. I think that we'll eventually get to it. But right now, I would say what we do probably works for between 60 and 70% of people with IDD, but there are people whose impairments are just so great that we don't know how to do it yet. Many people don't have natural supports. They don't have viable supporters in the world of aging from which I originally came. And I was the chair of the ABA Commission on Law and Aging and so forth. And we did a lot of work about what we then called the unbefriended elderly. I think there's a better term now, but they're just people who just don't have any supports at all. And so that's really an issue. And there are ways that people are dealing with that, but it's a huge issue. We know that our model is not directly transferable. It's not like you just walk into people who are, mildly or moderately demented and say, okay, now let's do a 14 session facilitation, 3-phase facilitation process, and then it'll all be great and we'll sing Kumbaya. And also people with psychosocial disabilities. And as I said, we were incredibly fortunate because there were all these people who had done all this great work. And so we had a lot to begin with, but there's been virtually nothing on people with psychosocial disabilities or older people with cognitive decline. It's just, it's partly accident, it's partly because it feels like it's a harder nut to crack. And I would say that there has been some work on people with TBIs, particularly coming out of Australia. But anyway, okay. So here's another interjection. So what about everybody else, right? Older people who have lost capacity. Unlike people with IDD, who we think and imagine can learn and grow, the trajectory for older people is sadly generally downhill. People with mental illness, their capacity fluctuates. Some days they've got it and some days they don't, or they have it, but they're making decisions that everybody else thinks are really terrible decisions. And then people with TBI who are sort of in the middle, they had capacity, they lost it, but they also have the capacity to learn and grow. So there's this whole spectrum that suggests that there are really different considerations for individuals in these different groups. So for people with IDD, what we're trying to do obviously is to increase capacity, to build autonomy, to enable inclusion in society, and to prevent discrimination. For older people, I think it's much more about retaining as much autonomy as possible, conserving and augmenting existing capabilities and capacities, and foregrounding dignity. And so now I want to share a slide with you. It's a quote that is just unbelievably poignant and that really nails the difference about what's important for these two groups, but that also I think reinforces my desire to include the golden rule as part of what guides us here. So I'm just going to read it, even though it usually makes me cry. However worthwhile and valuable what comes in the future may be, and now we're talking about older people, it will not include greater freedom or autonomy. When freedom is curtailed in early dementia, it's final chances that are being foregone, not first chances with plenty of second chances to come. These are the last times something will be attempted or done. And perhaps it is a recognition of this, however dimmed by disease, that makes the desire to do something so curiously linger and even intensify after the physical or mental capacity to do it safely has begun to slip away. I'm 2 months from being 80, and I see myself in this, and I see people that I know in this. And I think it really highlights for us why this is so important, why people need to be able to feel like they still have agency in their own lives. Okay, so given these differences, given the, it's upward and onward for the hopefully for the folks with IDD, it's sort of downward and last chances and just clinging to a sense of selfhood and personhood. What can help us learn, because we have to learn, design and then pilot the kinds of supports that older people need and can use effectively, since those are obviously two different things. So I want to posit that the answer goes back to the duality, or if you will, the multiplicity of what supported decision-making is. And that is to say that it is both a practice, a means by which people are more self-determined and autonomous, or retain their self-determination and autonomy, to make their own decisions without being subject to guardianship. But it's also a necessary component of the human right of legal capacity. So I want to take a very quick look at the germinal human rights document for people with disabilities, which is the CRPD. And there's a resource slide at the very end of this that has a link to the CRPD. I would really encourage you to read it. I find it an incredibly inspiring document. I find human rights a really optimistic way of looking at the world. And I think that the CRPD really describes the world that we want for people with disabilities and, gives us some blueprint of the way to get there. But one of those rights is the right to legal capacity. So first, the first important piece of this is that everybody has legal capacity and should be able to enjoy that right on an equal basis with others. And I'll give you the definition of legal capacity in a minute. But third paragraph says that not only do people have this right, but that the state has an obligation to provide access to people with disabilities in order to exercise legal capacity. So you've got it, but you might need some help to exercise it, and that's what the state's supposed to do. And in many ways, that's what you're doing with your clients. Okay, next slide. So legal capacity, and this is from the UN commissioner, includes the capacity to act intended as both capacity and the power to engage in undertaking or transaction. So it's about having the right, but it's also about having agency in your own life. And that's what people need supports to be able to do when they have disabilities. Okay. Next slide. This is the fourth paragraph. It's long. I'm just giving it to you as a resource. It really deals with sort of the guideposts or the guardrails for people who have very severe disabilities and how one can support them in a way that is consistent with human rights. So I think it's useful, and it's something that was thought about by the people who wrote this convention. Okay, next slide. So how does all of this fit in with what Project Guardianship is already doing, and also with what new avenues you might already be agreed to explore, or I might be able to push you a little bit to explore. And I've just chosen two because I'm struck particularly historically by the work of the Vera Project, and now by you, about keeping people in the community. And Article 19 of the CRPD says that people have a right to live in the community in a place that they choose, a place of their choosing. And so you're doing that. You might not be calling it an Article 19 human right, but you're doing it. And so you're in the human rights community, whether you explicitly say that or not. And then in the CRPD, and this goes right back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1946, which was after World War II, and all the nations of the world came together to define human rights that every nation owed to its citizens, and they all agreed to them, which is where human rights come from. And in the right up front in the CRPD, as a general principle, is respect for the inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices. And if I had time, I would have counted the times that you use dignity in how you describe what you do and what's a fundamental principle for yourselves. So why is supported decision-making important for you? First of all, it really aligns with your mission statement, right? We know that there are injustices in guardianship, and here's a model of providing guardianship that maximizes autonomy and engages the client in decision-making. There we have it. We have dignity, we have decision-making, we have autonomy, all the stuff that again, I think that quote from Bruce Jenner, just brings home to us about why it is so important. And if I had my usual hour or whatever, I would make us all do an exercise in which at the end we would say, oh my God, this is who I am. If I couldn't do these things, I wouldn't be who I am. And now I understand. And yes, kumbaya. But in any event, obviously it's what you're already doing. And I think it gets reflected in the services that you provide within guardianship. And I have to say that even though I've spent, probably the last 20 years trying to, if not abolish guardianship, at least pare it back as far as possible. I mean, I recognize that there are people who need guardians. I would like to see people get out of it as quickly as possible. I would like to see Sarah's client, Ms. C, develop a supported decision-making network to a point where she really has a system in place, the process that we talked about, so that she doesn't need you and she doesn't need to have her rights taken away, and she can be a full agent in her own life, but have the supports that's necessary to make good decisions. And also sometimes to make bad decisions, because we all do. People should not be precluded from making any decisions just because they make some bad ones. But again, looking at what you do, what you have done, and your strategic plan, I think that there's also an extraordinary opportunity here to enlist you in trying to do for older people, for people with cognitive decline, maybe for these dual diagnoses, people like Ms. C that we don't yet have a real handle on, how you can be part of that process, because you have recognized, and it's so true, that it's not enough to just make guardianship better. I mean, I think it's amazing that you exist. I think it's amazing that you are funded, but there are real limitations on the number of people that you can serve. And it's not like that number is going to be increased exponentially by huge amounts of funding, particularly at a time when services are being cut back. So obviously keeping people out of guardianship is an important thing. And so here you are, to reduce the overall need for guardianship. And then when all else fails, i.e. when there is no less restrictive alternative available, to do good guardianship, and to do person-centered planning, and to promote autonomy, and to guarantee least restrictive setting, and to honor dignity. So the question that I would leave you with, I hope I've stuck within my 20 minutes, is how, for me, looking at the problem, which I've been thinking about, or I don't say problem, the challenge, the opportunity that I've been thinking about for years and years, about what we need to do to protect and preserve autonomy and dignity for older people, for people with, with mental illness, for people with TBI, and of course for people with IDD, is that you have this incredible resource of this varied base of clients with different abilities, with different challenges, who we could try different stuff with, and see what works for whom and what doesn't, and start to refine that in a way that we have done over the last 12 years or 15 years for people with IDD, so that we can in fact figure out what supports are necessary to make supported decision-making an effective, viable, less restrictive alternative to guardianship, and not just in the abstract, but for the purpose of amplifying, preserving, and promoting autonomy, self-determination, and above all, dignity for people with disabilities. So that's my shtick. And here's some resources. There's our website has lots and lots of stuff on it. If you want to look at the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which I really would encourage you to do, that's the link. And then we have this wonderful little video that I would have shown, but it's 3 minutes long and I didn't have 3 minutes, of one of our decision makers just talking about what this process has meant to her and how she uses it. So look at Jessica, she's great. And note that although she's reading, she is not reading something we gave her. She's reading a statement that she wrote, but she is the decision maker and she wanted to read it. She didn't want to pretend to memorize it or whatever. So I would urge you to look at that too, because it's really quite wonderful. So thank you. I hope I didn't overstep. And
no, this has been terrific. Thank you so, so much. And I really appreciate the fact that you linked this to our strategic plan, which we are in the process of bringing alive, I guess. And I can see so many points of what you said that resonate. It's a framework for our work. This question of when you end guardianship is something we've talked about. And then pieces of what the work that we do and how we can share and and give that to the larger community is something we're talking about now in some of our work expanding statewide. We do have about 5 minutes for questions. But again, I also want to say to folks, we will continue this conversation in different places. And I hope Judge Glenn will come back and talk to us in different ways, because this is just such an important piece of what we're thinking about and what we're doing. So questions, comments?
I have both.
Okay, I didn't see.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
No,
I should have raised the hand.
I
I just
people move
jumped
around
in.
on the screen, and I'm like, whoa.
Yeah. This was wonderful. And very grounding in terms of a conversation about what supportive decision making is. I guess the thing that strikes me in the convergence of what you're doing and what we're doing is the issue of scale. And to get to the place that we want, scale is the issue.
right.
So I wonder how you're looking at the issue of scale just with the IDD population that you're talking about, and maybe the pilot that you are advancing as a piece of getting to scale. That's my big concern for the other populations, is just how do we ever scale in a way that maximizes the reach of something like this that is so vital? So that's it.
I mean, that's the big question. Also, thank you for the kind words coming from you, because like I'm a big fan of yours and your work. So thank you. Yeah, it's the big question, and it's a question that you can't ask till you do the earlier work. You have to know what it is that works, and then you have to figure out how to scale it up, right? So with all the background, it took us 6 years to really figure out this. I mean, we know that what we do works. As I say, it doesn't work for everybody, but for the people it works. And that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people in New York State. So then how do we do that? And part of what we were charged with under the DDPC grant was to think about sustainability. So we actually came up with a model, which, I don't have time to talk to you about now. We could do it offline or whatever, but we came up with a model by which OPW could, and probably through contracting it out, actually offer the process that we do to everybody who wants it. 1,500 people a year, 1,000 people a year, or whatever, and that it would come from multiple sources. It would be paid for from multiple sources. We actually hired one of these fancy financial consulting firms to do a cost benefit analysis that says that we budget out what this thing that we are now piloting in a little model that would probably have to be scaled up by 8, but we're creating the whole thing. We're trying to create a turnkey operation. And then at the end of 3 years, OPW can bid it out. Somebody can walk in, they'll have everything. They'll have the IT, they'll have the training, they'll have the materials, they'll have everything. And they just scale it. And we build in how you scale it. That if they do that, it probably costs between $3.5 and $4 million a year, which is not nothing, but in an $80 billion budget, it's chump change. And we have shown that there will be savings to the state at a minimum of $7 million, probably closer to 15. I mean, I just think it's uncontrovertible. And so we have done, or we are about to do, what no one in the world has done, which is to answer the question you asked. Like, how do we do this for everybody, right? And I think we have, but it was those steps, and that's why I wanted to kind of talk about the way we've done it and the way that we want to talk about it. And this is for a longer conversation, but in my conversations with Kimberly and then with Joan, I have a kind of idea of some partners to bring together to do the same kind of planned building of developing what the supports are and then figuring out how to deliver them and to do it in a cost-effective way. And it is cost-effective. I mean, look at how much money is spent on ER, on alternative levels of care in hospitals, on this, Miss C going back and forth. I mean, it's crazy.
We just heard it. Yeah, we just heard it.
I mean, you heard it. So we can do better than that, and it will cost less. But first, we have to know what it is, right?
Yep.
Thank you.
And for older people and people with dementia, it's very different. I should also say that there is some work. There's been some interesting work in Australia on using supported decision-making with people with dementia. And also within OPD right now, there is some kind of task force or something about these dual diagnoses, older people with DD, and developing life plans for autonomy for older people and whatever with dementia. So there's stuff going on, and it can be brought together. And I think we've done the roadmap, and a lot of people, both around the country and around the world, are literally looking at us because we have, in a very systematic way, started with showing how it can be done, demonstrating how it can be done, having all the wonderful stories of how it can be done. And if you go on our website, like, there's just millions of decision makers and parents and facilitators saying, fabulous, 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 transformative. And then going to the legislature and getting legislation that's hopefully going to recognize this. And by the way, is written to do the same thing once viable supports are developed for older people with cognitive decline and dementia. So the statute could be expanded to them, and then doing the cost benefit analysis and figuring out how to do it on a big scale. So probably more than you wanted to hear, but.
Victoria.
Yeah, this was powerful, really, really powerful. Thank you so much. So I was thinking my work's been in sort of mental health recovery and people with severe mental health problems. So there's been a lot of work in terms of person-centered care planning and advanced directives and some of these kind of parallel efforts. But a lot of it has been driven by people with lived experience sort of driving some of this.
Absolutely.
And and you were talking about partners, and I wondered, were you partnering with consumer groups, family groups, and how does that work?
Well, what's interesting to me is that, again, I really turn to the international community and who has done anything in this at all. And there may be more stuff going on now. I can't follow everything, but several years ago, I was able to visit a project in Kenya. And I sat in on a number of meetings in Nairobi that was funded by the Open Societies Foundation. And on supported decision-making, essentially, and legal capacity for people with mental illness. And it's really based on peer support. I mean, that's a completely different model than what we have in IDD. Although I would say that a few of our decision makers actually are supporters for other decision makers, but so many people with mental illness do not have natural supports. They've alienated their families or been alienated from their families or whatever. And there is just a way in which the peer support is, seems to me to be the most likely way to deal with this. And again, there's very little work. I mean, you have to think about it. You have to, develop a plan. You have to figure out a way to pilot it, and then you have to see it if it works. And then some of it will work and some of it won't work. And then you'll, refine it and do it a little bit differently. And, after 6 years or 12 years or whatever, you'll have it. And it's worth doing, because obviously what we're doing with mental health now is just like a nightmare, really a nightmare.
I'm going to give, thank you. I'm going to give Judy the last question.
So it's not a question, but sort of an observation. I did 2 trainings this week for CEUs. I'm a social worker, and there are these 2 women. They have their own business, and they're not calling it supported decision making, but they work specifically with the dementia population. And they have developed what they're calling templates. And it's, the title of their presentations was, humanistic care, where they were doing, I found it really interesting that they were doing things and they have decks of templates to elicit from the individual with dementia their choices about things.
Fabulous.
It sounds very much like supported decision making.
Yeah.
But they're not calling it that.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how much of this kind of stuff, I mean, this is often the frustration coming from the provider side,
Right.
is the lack of research, the lack of coordination. And there are probably so many, you work on an international scale, so many programs in very small target groups are doing amazing stuff out there. And it's a frustration, you talk about scaling.
Right.
I was just so impressed by what these women are doing, and it's all targeted at people with dementia.
I think it's fabulous, and just as a as a teaser for the next conversations, I mean, I really see bringing you together with somebody who has the research and evaluation capacity like the Brookdale Center on Aging, and then this work that is being done around dementia. But there is some national work that's being done and some people who are connected to all of it, and that group of people in a in a sort of pilot or in a project can ferret out the stories that you just heard and start incorporating them in, and that's how you do it. Obviously, that's how you do it. So send me, please send me who they are. Although right now I'm too busy trying to scale up from $400,000 to $4 million. But
It's a good set of problems to have.
well, on a good day, yes. On a bad day, oh my God.
Yeah, no, understood.
But I'm really interested in that. And I know there's work going on. The question is, how do you put it together? And then how do you have a client base like yours that is so diverse that you can try, well, do the decks work with these people? Do these templates work with these people, or only with these people? Or do you present it differently? Or how do you do it? Or, are there different pieces in the templates and the decks? I mean, that's it, that's how we learn stuff. We try stuff and it works for some people and it doesn't work for others.
Well, thank you very, very much. I think this was an extraordinary learning opportunity for all of us. And certainly, as I said in the beginning, a conversation we want to continue. And we do want to figure out the ways we can work together. I think so much of what you talked about resonates very powerfully with what we're doing now and what we want to do. So again, thank you very much, Kristin Glen.
And I want to thank you, because it really actually is an honor to speak to you. And I think the work you do is so important. And I think when you tie it to the human rights lens, it's going to get even broader and even more effective and even more expansive. So I look forward to the continued conversations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Take care now.